Break 'em.
We're back for another edition of Education is Fashionable. Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be focusing on the labor force. This is going to be our second lesson in our fourth unit. We've already talked about wages and basically the things that can help you get a higher wage if you're looking to do that after you get out of high school. So like always, we're going to get started with learning targets. 4 learning targets for today. Explain what the labor force is and describe how it has changed over time. We're going to explain how occupations have changed over time due to technology and globalization. We're going to describe the factors that have contributed to the changing way in which people work, and we're going to explain how the way in which people work has changed over time. Now, first learning target obviously is going to be explain what the labor force is and describe how it's changed over time. Some key information you got to know. First of all, you should know what a civilian labor force is, and that's basically anyone who's age 16 and older that either has a job or is actively looking for a job. Now, you're going to want to remember that as we go forward, too, because we're going to start talking about unemployment and calculate the unemployment rate in future lessons, and you basically have to know what the workforce is, and basically it's the same thing. Some people do get excluded from this category, and that means those who are in the military and those who are in prison. Obviously, if you're in the military, you kind of have a job because you're in the military. And if you're in prison, well, you're not going to be part of the civilian labor force. And I have students all the time, well, Mr. Norm, you can get a job in prison. Yeah, you're right, you can, but we're still not going to count you. So some other things, too, though, is we exclude students when considering this category, too, because, if you're a student, well, you kind of have a job. It's to be a student. In previous generations, workers could depend on receiving benefits such as insurance and retirement from their employer. And those opportunities still exist today, but they're not as abundant as they used to be. So the labor force is bigger, so that's one of the changes that have happened over time, and it's primarily because women have been entering the workforce. So we look at about, say, well, for the United States, it was more about World War II. If you go over to Europe, that's going to be starting around World War I. But women have become a large part of the workforce. It also comes from a large number of people receiving higher education, just another way that the labor force has changed. And more education, as we talked about in previous lessons, normally leads to higher wages compared to foreign nations. The United States, with all the knocks that it gets as far as where it ranks amongst other countries in terms of education, we still have a very high level of education as far as our population is concerned. And that's part of the reason why our workers get so much money for working the jobs that they have. So that's some of the changes in the labor force as it's gotten bigger, and they've actually become smarter and more well-trained. The labor force pretty much breaks down into 3 categories: primary, secondary, and tertiary. And if you've never heard of tertiary, which of course probably not many have, that's just, that's the 3rd category. Let's get into each one of these. We're going to talk about the primary sector. And those are jobs that are basically related to natural resources. So if you're a farmer, if you're working in the woods cutting down trees and forestry, maybe you do fishing, or maybe you do mining. Any of those things would be considered jobs in the primary sector. So anything directly related to natural resources. We've also got the secondary sector, and that's jobs related to the production of goods. It includes the production of energy and materials needed to make those specific goods. You could be a steel worker, you could be a truck driver, you could be a construction worker. So, anything that's related to making goods. We could say, I would say like any type of factory worker, or any type of, I'd still say factory worker, but I was going to talk about somebody who works on the assembly line at an automobile plant. Someone who works, making anything really. So let's get into the tertiary sector. That's where I pretty much come into play, and those are service-related jobs. So anything that provides a service. So banking, selling insurance. If you, I've done most of the things that I have listed here, at least half. Retail, because I used to work at Old Navy. I used to work at Macy's. I worked as a grocery store clerk. And then education is another one. So, anything that provides a service. Communications is also a form of the tertiary sector because it's a service-related job. And all of the 10 fastest-growing fields of employment belong to the service area, with most of those being in the medical field. So, like my wife She works at a hospital as a physical therapist. She doesn't provide goods, she provides a service, so she's considered part of the tertiary sector too. So now that we've covered a little bit of, of what the workforce is like, can you check your understanding? So can you actually explain what the labor force is? So that goes back to when we talked about the civilian labor force. And can you describe how it changed over time? I basically went over two major ways as to how it has changed over time. If you want to throw like an extra bonus one in there, you could always say list and describe the three types of sectors that are out there. But it's not necessary for you to do that, but it wouldn't hurt either though. Learning Target 2 can explain how occupations have changed over time due to technology and some globalization. So the labor force is not the only aspect of the economy that has continued to change. Occupations have changed as well. I mean, you can sit there and look around today and see jobs that they're not like they used to. I mean, even the job that I have teaching, if we look at how it was when I was in high school, what I'm doing right now isn't actually capable back then. The internet was barely around. I didn't even have any actual experience with the internet until, like regular experience, until I was in college. So, and the speeds of the internet that I had experienced, the things that you have on your phone were faster than what I was able to basically experiment with when I was around your age. So occupations have changed, and you'll see also, if you look into it, that jobs have changed. Like, there are jobs that are available today that certainly weren't out when, I was 5, 6, 7, 10, 15 years old. So, but anyways, the changing labor force and the creation of new jobs, technological changes have caused many jobs to either change in the way that they are done or have been entirely eliminated. Some examples might be like factories becoming more mechanized, and then when that happens, the employer needs less workers. So some people are losing their jobs because of the way that labor has changed. Oftentimes, workers are let go from their jobs because, like I said, they just don't need them. I can have a machine do your job. Much of the jobs that are in factories have been, that used to have people in them, have been taken over by robots. The effect of the personal computer and internet has also changed the way that people work. So we have the way in which information is stored and retrieved changed drastically because of computers and the internet. I can communicate easily. I mean, granted, it's not done all that much anymore, but, email is still very, very popular in terms of communication when you get out of, personal communication. A lot of my work-related conversations to try and basically spread ideas are done through email and not necessarily through text message. So, and about half of the workers in the United States use a computer for their job. I'm using one right now. I use one to enter grades. I used a computer when I was at a grocery store to ring up groceries. I used a computer when I worked in retail at Macy's to ring up clothes or to put orders in. So, computers are pretty much, I can't really think of too many jobs where a computer's not used. Maybe if you cut grass, maybe if you're a landscaper, you might not need a computer. But then again, at the same time, I have seen landscaping companies use computers. It was more from the design aspect, though, not from actually the doing things in your yard things. But so basically what happens is, in today's society, if you don't have basic computer skills, you're going to have a hard time finding a job, or at least keeping one. So let's reflect a little bit. To emphasize how much labor force and jobs have changed over time, think on it. How many jobs in today's market are available today that weren't available 25 years ago? Or how many jobs can you think of that were available 25 years ago that aren't around today? Or I guess you could throw a third one in there. Think of a job today, and if it has been around for the last 25 years, how has it actually changed? But in the end, you should basically be realizing that change is inevitable, and whether it's the job has been eliminated or it's been drastically changed how you actually do those jobs, it's going to actually have some change involved with it. So some other things too, let's talk about globalization and jobs. So how have jobs become more global? It's really what globalization means. So many countries have sought to eliminate jobs by outsourcing them. And what that basically means, it's a process of contracting with an outside company to provide necessary goods or services. And you're probably sitting here going, I have no idea what you're talking about, but when I give you an example later, you'll actually have an idea of that you actually have had some experience with it. But basically, the terms become linked with the idea that companies send these jobs to foreign countries in order to pay them cheaper wages, which is true. And more jobs are outsourced to companies within the United States than sent abroad. Now, that is actually something that most people aren't aware of. Normally, when people think outsourcing, they just simply think of the previous one where, well, I'm going to send these jobs to another country to have them done for me, and that way I can just pay these people a fraction of the cost that I would pay an American worker. Well, that's not always the case, as we can talk about things in your textbook pointing out that, you might outsource a job, but it might go somewhere else in the United States. The other thing too, other nations will send their work to the United States to be completed, and that comes back to what we had talked about earlier, because the United States has a highly educated workforce. An example of outsourcing that you might be familiar with, because I said I'd come up with an example, is have you ever called a call, like a customer service line, like a service call center? Now, what has happened over time is that many American companies move their call centers to places like India, and that's why you'll get that person who obviously has a foreign accent, and it hasn't always worked out that well, because sometimes what happens is the customers for that company get so frustrated trying to talk to somebody who, let's face it, I know it's probably a tough thing because they're not speaking their native language, but it's hard to understand them. And they've had enough backlash where they've actually moved jobs back to the United States. But that's just another example. I mean, I can recall a time where I had stayed on hold for like literally an hour, and I finally get someone, and I was having such a hard time understanding them. I asked to speak to someone else, and they were like, no, and they hang up on me. So I was like, I'm not going to tell you what company that was, but I ain't never buying anything from that company again based off of that one experience. So, I mean, maybe you've had a case like that, maybe not. I mean, usually they do a pretty good job, just with my experience that one particular time, and I wasn't mad that I couldn't understand him. It was more of I was on hold for an hour and you just hung up on me. But anyways, so let's do this. Can you explain how occupations have changed over time due to technology and due to globalization? If you can do those things, you'll be just fine. If you can't do them, maybe rewind the video, maybe 3.5, 4 minutes back. I don't spend a whole lot of time on each of these. I'd like to try and break it up into chunks, but you should be able to do that pretty easily. So our next learning target is going to be describe the facts that have contributed to changing the way in which people work. So the way people work has changed. Basically, it's a common theme throughout this lesson because of technology. We're going to talk about it a little differently, though. In this case, workers no longer have to physically commute to their jobs because of the internet and computers. While I don't do this, there are jobs out there where I could teach and would never have to really leave my house. I see those job postings all the time. They get emailed to me. It's just not really the setting I want to be in, but I could do that. And some people just work from home all the time. Now, this is referred to as telecommuting. That's when you work from home. Some other things that have changed too is the loss of permanent positions. Some companies are also offering fewer jobs with benefits such as retirement and health care. Thankfully that hasn't happened to the field I'm in. We have contingent employees, which means that you just work less than 40 hours a week. We also have independent contractors, which are people who sell their services to a business on a contract basis. So, you could be working for a different company every few months or so, like an independent contractor and a contingent employee. My wife has the opportunity, if she wanted to, she could basically become a contingent employee where she only works part-time, or she has been approached to basically have her services used for various hospitals for a couple months at a time. And, the trade-off is she would possibly be making more money, but then at the same time, we see some things that aren't offered to her, like retirement benefits and health insurance. So those are some of the things we also mentioned a little bit earlier. Well, there are also some positives and negatives associated with telecommuting. It's reduced stress. There's an expanded labor pool, so there are more people that employers could be drawing from. And of course, my favorite one is less traffic, because if people are staying home, that means there's less people that I have to fight with on I-75 and I-94 to get to work. Some negatives, basically work spills over. So, I mean, I've seen this before. There have been times where, granted, I don't telecommute, but there are days where I specifically take off and try and work from home, and then I'm like, yeah, I'm only going to work until 3 o'clock, and then it's 5:30 and I'm still working. So some of the problems with telecommuting is sometimes when you should be having your own personal time, like when you would normally be out of the office or normally away from the workplace, you're still working too. Also, workers feel as if they miss out. So some people feel like, oh, I could have gotten a promotion if I had actually been someone who worked in the actual physical office or something like that. There's also the feeling where people really enjoy being around others. They enjoy having that interaction with other coworkers in person, not necessarily over an email or over a conference call or over like a Skype call. But, people really like to have that interaction. And obviously with telecommuting, it isn't an option. So some alternatives to permanent employees, basically hiring contingent and contract workers makes it easier for a business to adjust their workforce to suit production needs. So, if I need more workers, I can hire them for the short term. I mean, you could even take a look at that like holiday seasonal type workers. They need more workers to be on the floor during the Christmas month, and then after that, they don't need them, and that's why they're called seasonal, and that's why they're usually let go after the Christmas season is over with. It's cheaper for a company to eliminate a contingent or contract employee than a full-time one, because normally when you have a full-time employee, as a company, you have to pay something called unemployment insurance, which you don't really know what that is yet because we haven't gotten there yet, but just think of it. For every full-time employee I have to pay a additional fee in basically the form of unemployment insurance. And if you don't know what that is, if you ever hear someone saying, yeah, I'm collecting unemployment, well, there's the way that money was raised to actually have that, and that's through the unemployment the employer has to basically pay for. Most temporary workers do not receive benefits and are also cheaper because of this. Again, that's another way to save money for the company. If I don't have to pay for your benefits like health insurance or vision or retirement, so any of those things, eliminating them makes it cheaper for the employer. Now, there are some benefits of being an independent contractor. You basically have the flexibility of being your own boss. You can take whatever jobs you want, and you can obviously deny the ones you don't want either. Some other things, contract workers are willing to risk not being able to find enough work to pay for their needs at times for the freedom of being their own boss. So there is kind of like that risk reward. It's like, yeah, I'm my own boss. And then you might be finding yourself during a time where you really need money, where you don't have any work to do, so you don't have money. Some other problems too, when you're an independent contractor, as you've probably already figured out, I don't have any health care or retirement, so I have to take on those burdens too. And health care is not cheap, especially if you're trying to find it on your own. One of the reasons why health care is cheap enough as it is when you have a job that offers it is because the employer takes on some of that cost. It's a shared cost. Now, at times, employers will offer permanent positions to contingent or contract employees. I've seen it. It wasn't offered to me, but some of the individuals I worked with during the seasonal times, when I worked at Macy's, they were offered full-time work after that. So it's not always a negative to be a contingent employee. It can always turn into something better. My wife has seen people turn into full-time employees too at the hospital, where they start off at part-time and then they have a need that they need to fill full-time, and those are the people that they go with first because they're familiar with them and like their work. Some other things that go on is we have changing careers more often. So as technology advances, jobs change as well. When new technology is created, so are new jobs. The other things too, older professions become less in demand as well. I'm trying to think of one. No, I can't really think of one off the top of my head. I'm not going to sit here and go him and haw trying to conjure up one, because then the video is going to be way long as it is. It's already 20 minutes long. But basically some other things too. Workers must learn to adapt to these new jobs, or they face the likelihood that they will have their position eliminated. So if your job changes and it has new technology included in it, and you're unable to basically meet that changing environment, you're not going to have a job. So this goes back to something we talked about earlier, where you really need to have some basic computer skills, because if you don't, it's going to be really difficult. Like even my father, who's about as old timer as you can get, and really bad with learning new technology. You know, he teaches how to run a crane, and he's had to basically learn computer skills when he didn't have any. And if he didn't, you know, he couldn't continue in that particular role. Companies have to become more flexible because technology as well. Globalization has allowed companies to move jobs overseas. Workers could find themselves having to learn new skills every 3 to 5 years because of changing technology. I mean, that kind of brings up that joke. It's like, hey, I just bought this brand new computer, and then 3 months later, it's out of date, and you need to buy a new one. But anyways, it doesn't matter. All right, so basically, our last checking for understanding, sort of, because you know the last one is always going to be the summary one. So can you describe the factors that have contributed to changing the way in which people work? And you know, just a hint, it's all going to basically be technology based. And then obviously our last all of the learning targets that were established at the beginning of this little video. Can you explain what the labor force is and describe how it has changed over time? Can you explain how occupations have changed over time due to technology and globalization? Can you describe the factors that have contributed to changing the way in which people work? And can you explain how the way in which people work has changed over time? I know a lot of these sound similar, so you should be able to do them. I mean, they just have a little slight answer change, or slight change in the explanation of each of these. If you can do all those, you should be fine. If you could have done all the other checks for understanding, then you can do all 4 of these. And if you can do all 4 of these, then I guess you're having a good day after all. Until next time, we're going to be shutting it down for now. Have a nice day.